Peter, it's a long way from the country town of Minlaton in South Australia, where you were born, to Darwin, where Maestro is set. Can you tell us a little about your own years growing up and how you came to be a writer?
Well, Minlaton is a tiny town which likes to style itself as the barley capital of the world. It's a long way, certainly, from Darwin. It's also a winner. Minlaton was a winner of several Tidy Town awards in South Australia. But my parents were both teachers. They were gypsies, if you like, education department gypsies in those days. If you're a teacher, you spent 2 years here and then on you went 2 years somewhere else. So we went all over South Australia, a couple of years in Adelaide, then ended up in this very different place, Darwin, which is very special to me, arriving as a rather buttoned-up southerner in this place of great freedom and great difference. There's tropical abundance too. And at a time when I was coming of age, I guess, sexually and intellectually, and so I loved it.
With those memories of Darwin, what inspired you to write Maestro? Was there a story that you had to tell?
Well, I'd had a character, the character basically in early form of the teacher Keller, and who I'd been putting together for some years, and I didn't know where he belonged. Now, I was in Brisbane, actually, as a writer-in-residence, and I was feeling a bit lonely one night, and it started to rain, and it was a warm rain, that kind of rain that magnifies and amplifies the sense of the earth. And those smells were wonderfully evocative to me. They brought back my adolescence in Darwin, transported me back there immediately. So I began writing this memoir of Darwin, of adolescence, which is kind of steeped in nostalgia. And then when I started doing that, suddenly I realised this character I'd had for a long time, Keller, that's where he belonged. He was the kind of exile that Darwin, which was a frontier town in those days, used to attract. And once I bunged him into that environment, that scenario, he sort of took over what began as a bit of a travelogue, and he took it away in the directions that it had to go.
Keller, the music teacher, is a fascinating figure. Where does this character come from?
Well, I'd learned piano as a child myself. Actually, in Penola, I began to learn piano. My parents were both very good pianists. My brother's a good pianist, my smarter younger brother. And my daughter is a very, very good pianist. So I grew up in a musical environment. Keller himself, though, was a bit of a composite character. I had an English teacher in Darwin, or there was an English teacher in Darwin. There was a great mind, but also an alcoholic, some notoriety around town, and it fascinated me how these things can go together. And then when I was at medical school, I had a friend of mine whose father was a pianist he played for his own pleasure, not publicly, but he was a survivor of Auschwitz. His first wife and children were murdered there. He was different to Keller. He said that music's what kept him sane, that persuaded him there was something worth living for. And then my daughter has a great piano teacher, a Russian woman in Adelaide, a genius, I think. And so those things were composites, and they came together in the character of Keller.
First novels are often described as being autobiographical, the novel the author has to write. Would you describe Maestro as autobiographical?
I think all writing is, even if it's, say, a script for Terminator in a movie, will have elements from the writer's life, because the things that matter most, to the writer's heart are the things that are going to make art powerful, whatever its form. But certainly of all my books so far, I guess it's the most narrowly autobiographical. There's a lot of me in the character of Paul, but not all of me, and there are other people in Paul as well. There's some of me in Paul's father, the doctor who prefers to play the piano or grow rambutans and pineapples or whatever. There's a bit of that sort of hobby farmer doctor. I mean, I'm a doctor who prefers to write books. And there's a bit of me in Keller too. The puritanical side of me is there in Keller. And I think characters often represent warring parts of the writer's own personality sometimes.
Paul, in fact, tells us the story of Maestro, but how do you, as the author, get around the limitations of this point of view?
Well, I think the story, to some extent, comes to us over Paul's head. He doesn't even know some of the things he's telling us at times. In the middle of the book, there's a scene where Paul's in a library in the south doing some research on Keller, and he hears a couple making love in the next aisle, and he does, well, what a lot of us would do. He pulls out a book and sort of peers through. I mean, I'd pull out a whole shelf, but he pulls out a book here, a book there, And what does he see? Well, he doesn't see the whole thing. He sees bits and pieces, and has to... to me, this is a metaphor for the whole narrative style of the book. That is, Paul's telling the story, but what's he telling us? Not a lot. He's giving us glimpses of Keller, and we, the readers, have to join the dots, so to speak. We have to fill in the missing bits. And a lot of readers will be more intelligent than Paul, and they'll see things long before he does, I think, in the book, even though, paradoxically, he's giving us the material from which we can make those judgments.
Maestro was your first novel, followed by Honk a Few Jesus, and the novella and story collection Little Deaths, and now your new novel, Wish, which we've worked on together. You've also published quite a lot of poetry. Looking back at Maestro, what do you most like about this first novel?
Well, what I liked about it at the time was I'd written a couple of novels before that. I'd written a novel that I just couldn't get right. I'd trying to get it perfect, and I'd written something like 30, 40 drafts, which are still in their own wardrobe at home. You know, it's the first novel in the history of literature that's taller than its writer. But then, and I decided that, you know, there was no such thing as a perfect novel, that you couldn't, that the novel was a paralysing form. And I came to write Maestro, and it happened very quickly, and I loved that. It wrote itself. This character took it over. And so when I came to read it again when it was published, I loved it. And that doesn't happen with me, with things I write very often. And so I decided then and there I was never going to read it again, because I wanted to love it forever. And when I've read my books again previous to Maestro, that I'd hated them often and thought, you know, are they really that bad? Well, Maestro, to me, it seemed to me more intelligent than I am. You know, there were things in there I didn't even remember putting in, and that's the thing I loved about it. It had it came very quickly and had a spontaneity. It seemed to write itself through me. And if that doesn't sound too pretentious, but that's what I love about it.
So how do you feel about this very smooth-flowing novel being analysed so heavily?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because here I am on one hand saying, you know, I like to say that Maestro is a book that doesn't say too much, that implies to imply things, and then I've got people going over with a fine-tooth comb. I find it interesting, though. I often learn things from those analyses, but students, of course, are terrified of things being over-analysed, of being pulled to bits. They hate that notion. When I was in year 12, I read in Gertrude Stein's autobiography, an American writer. She was studying philosophy with William James. It was the day of the final philosophy exam. It was a beautiful day outside. She wrote, "Dear Professor James, it's too nice a day to be doing exams. I'm going outside in the sun, full stop." He gave her the top distinction of all the candidates, because what's philosophy? It's the study of how we should live our lives, and on a good day, how we live our life, we go outside in the sun. Well, when I was in year 12, and I was a bit like Paul Crabbe, a bit of a smart aleck, and I read this story, came the mid-year year 12 English exam. There was a question on Hamlet, which I thought was far too intricate, and I said, you know, "Dear teacher, Shakespeare was writing bloody entertainments for illiterate audiences. He didn't intend this kind of analysis, full stop." And I walked out feeling pretty pleased with myself, being, as I say, a bit of a smart aleck, expecting to get the top distinction. And of course I got 0%. And I was wrong, because you know, a novel like Maestro, I'm happy for people to read it on one level as the story of a relationship between a teacher and a student and how they grow as a result of that relationship. But I'm even happier if they read it again or think about it, some of the underlying issues that are debated beneath the surface. There's an iceberg there that I think people can put together, can join the dots, if you like, and see this greater picture and get a greater satisfaction from the book.
Some readers might find it disappointing that Paul in fact doesn't go on to become the great musician, but are there other lessons for Paul?
Well, I'd like to think that the most important lessons he learns from his piano teacher are not to do with the piano at all, but are life lessons, if you like. I think certainly by the end of the book he's grown. He's become a much more sensitive, less self-obsessed sort of person, a more mature person. And okay, he may or may not go on to be a great pianist, but I think he's a better human being.
Again, I think some readers find Paul's choices in relationships surprising. What does Rosie have that Megan doesn't?
Well, I certainly think she's she's a much more intelligent and sensitive person, and more the kind of person that more a soulmate for Paul, if you like. Megan's a bit of a cipher. She's the beauty that's skin deep, if you like, and initially seductive, as you know, in the way that art is seductive. but finally she's not for Paul.
Authors often say they never quite finish writing a manuscript. If you had the chance, is there anything you would change in Maestro?
Well, I haven't read it, as I said.
You've never read it again?
No, since that time. However, I have changed one line, which may sound odd, but what happened was in an essay written by Andrew Reamer, he talked about it. He liked the book, but he singled out a line he thought was stating the obvious, that the meaning of that line was already implicit in the previous paragraph. And I thought he was right. It was getting back to what I'm saying about, I think good writing implies things rather than spells them out. And I thought this line was gilding the lily and stating what was already implicit in the previous chapter, and so I scrapped it. But that's the change. I'm sure if I read the book again, there'd be others like that I'd want to change, but I'm not going to read it again.
On the question of changing the manuscript, how do you view the role of the editor? Are you a very private writer, or do you seek other people's input?
Well, I generally talk a lot about, I have friends in Adelaide who don't like reading the books because they say it's like reliving every conversation they've had with me for the past 3 years. And so I think your obsessions, you tend to talk about them with friends. And then what I do, I get a first draft down. I wouldn't show that to anyone because it's just too embarrassing. But after maybe about second draft, I'd show it. I show it to members of my family, and I have a couple of friends in Adelaide I show it to, and they'll give me some feedback, negative, positive, whatever that you can take or leave. And I enjoy that process. And then if you have a good editor, you're going to learn, you get a lot from that objective viewpoint as well. You're too close to things yourself to be a complete judge of them. A lot of great books in history have been largely written by great editors. You think of Thomas Wolfe, for instance, with Maxwell Perkins, but the American writer. Maxwell Perkins?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Collaborative work is clearly very appealing to you. In addition to all the books we've talked about, you're also involved with opera and film. Can you tell us a bit about some of these interests?
Well, the thing about writing novels is it's very lonely. Finally, just you get to that point where you are going through it with an editor or showing it to friends whose opinions you trust, more or less. But most of the time you're sort of shut in the convent of your study. And the Spanish filmmaker Luis Buñuel said that solitude's a wonderful thing, as long as you can talk about it with someone afterwards. And the great thing about working in film is, of course, you're writing and then you're going and showing it to the director or the actors or whoever, and you're getting a lot of feedback. The flip side of that is everyone who puts a buck into a movie thinks they have the right of some kind of creative veto or input, and you often end up with the lowest common denominator, but it's a very social process which I enjoy. And opera is different in that, well, as a writer I'm just writing the libretto, and the librettist is very much the junior partner in that venture. And for me I've been doing writing the libretto of for an opera of the Ray Lawler play, The Summer of the 17th Doll, and that's been the most difficult thing I think I've done, is trying to keep faith with the text, which is very much vernacular Australian comic, but also tragic comic mode, but trying to simplify that into something that can be sung into a much shorter text, and that's been terribly difficult. But I think it's starting to bear fruit now.
So what sort of music did you listen to as a teenager?
Well, when I was 17 I wanted to be Jimi Hendrix, basically, and I used to play the guitar. And I loved, but I've always liked classical music too, and I love jazz as well. But I grew up in a house where you heard Chopin or Debussy all day. The piano was played whenever my parents were home. Some of the scenes in Maestro to do with Gilbert and Sullivan operas are scenes from my childhood. My parents put on Gilbert and Sullivan operas in every country town in Australia, as far as I can tell, and I was in every one of them. I was a juror in Trial by Jury and The Pirate and Penzance, etc., etc. So, I still love that music. I love hearing that music on the radio. It's terrific. It makes me very happy. So I like it all, but there's not time for it all. And so these days I generally listen mostly to classical music.
And what do you play? If you could play one great piece, what would it be?
Gee, that's the impossible $1 million question. That's which 6 books would you take to the desert island or whatever. I was asked that recently. I was did a radio interview and had to choose 4 or 5 pieces of music of my favourites to play. They're mostly opera, actually, and they're mostly the female voice, which I love. I love the soprano voice. So I don't think I could actually play those, sing those, and try. But I'd need a bit of surgery to get up into the high register. On the piano, I love Debussy, I still do, and you know, I generally learn one new piece a year or so, and a Submerged Cathedral I've been playing lately, La Cathédrale Anglaise, and but I love Chopin, love it all.
Music's obviously a strong influence on your work, Peter, and so is poetry. How does being a poet affect your prose, and what sort of poetry do you like?
I think coming to fiction as a poet, it might make you a little bit precious in the way you look at sentences. I don't know about that. You know, finally there comes a time as a prose writer you have to get down and boogie, you know, but I think it gives you a respect for the cadences of the sentences and for the density of the words, and I like that. Actually, the prose I like best is the prose that's like that, and you often find that a lot of those writers are poets, or have been poets, I think. Poetry, I like lots of poetry. The poetry I like most, I mean, I love a poet like Gwen Harwood, for instance, but she's a poet I feel a great kinship to, that's my temperament, you know, that ironic style. But I think the poetry I love most is probably the opposite temperament, and that's someone like Les Murray, who's, you know, an expansive, all-inclusive kind of let rip kind of poet, and in some ways that's different, very different from my temperament, I think, and that's why I think as a writer you love the stuff that's opposite that you can't do.
Moving from that small and perfect canvas of poetry, how do you approach writing a novel? Did you have a vision of what Maestro would be?
Well, no, and that's one of the joys, I think, as a writer of a book like Maestro, that to some extent as you're writing it, you're a reader, and you're discovering what the reader discovers. It's taking you, your unconscious perhaps, is returning you to your usual obsessions, or showing you what your obsessions are, and you don't know where it's going, and you do discover things you didn't know that you knew, and that's miraculous when that happens. It doesn't happen all that often in prose. I think it happens in poetry a lot. Sometimes of necessity when you're writing a novel, which, say, a genre novel like a thriller or a mystery, you have to know where that's going. If you're writing a film script, you know exactly where it's going because the producers have told you where it's going, you know, at any number of meetings. But I love the freedom of a book like Maestro, or you know, a novella like the novella in Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam in my last book of stories, which is something that just was written through me, if you like. If that doesn't sound again too pretentious, but sometimes something else seems to take over your unconscious or whatever, and it's wonderful. It carries you along.
So it's not so much a particular story, but the character of Keller.
Yeah, I think it was the character of Keller, and then the relationship with Paul. And also I did want to discuss this beneath the surface, this question of, does art have certain moral responsibilities? Because of the power art has on our emotions, the power to seduce and convince us. Do certain responsibilities go with that?